2017, we might look back on as the year of peak robot anxiety. At least I hope we do. When the Dutch Grandmaster of Chess, Jan Donner, was asked how he would prepare for his upcoming match with the IBM super chess computer Deep Blue, he said, "I'm planning on bringing a hammer." And that sums up much, I think, of the anxiety that many people around the world have felt about the role of robots and automation in our communities, in our workplaces, and the implications for our jobs. And this issue has reached a crescendo over the last couple of years. The canonical study from the University of Oxford by Frey and Osborne talked about 47% of all jobs being lost or radically transformed by automation, a number that is so mind-boggling in its size as to stoke the anxiety of any person, young or old. Martin Ford, in his book Rise of the Robots, anticipates a future world not only where robots have taken all of our jobs, but we return to a period of techno-feudalism, as he describes it, where a few wealthy billionaires control all the money and the rest of us are technology serfs. It gets more dramatic from there. But I think there's a serious implication of robot anxiety. It's affecting us right now in three important ways. First, it's impeding our ability to develop good technology policy. It's very hard for a government in the context of this type of community fear to make policy that ensures Australia maintains its competitiveness, increases productivity, and capitalises on the benefits of new technology. And we've seen some of those impediments over the last 2 years, where the government has made strong attempts to promote innovation, but many of those have been questioned by the community and increasingly by parts of the political establishment. Secondly, I think robot anxiety impedes business model evolution, a critical driver of productivity growth in Australia. As long as community is fearful, workers are fearful, that is a drag on change, which is problematic for all of us who care about productivity growth and the dividend it provides to our economic future. And thirdly, and most importantly, this anxiety is unhelpful to individuals. I think it impedes them preparing for the inevitable changes that will affect all of our working lives. It prevents them from being proactive managers of their careers in the most fulsome way possible. And so for those reasons, I want to talk about three elements of the current narrative around automation and robotics in Australia. And I'm going to call those three elements fear, optimism, and fatalism. And I think all of them need to be approached with caution. And at the end, I'll describe what I think is an alternative to fear, optimism, and fatalism. Let's start with fear. This is coming from a legitimate place. Many Australians recognise rapid change in our workplaces. You can see on this chart over the last 25 years, there has been an enormous change in the Australian labour market. At the top end of the spectrum, jobs in community and personal services have increased by 87%, an enormous change. That's the healthcare workers, the disability workers, the childcare workers, right across the caring economy, which has grown so rapidly. Professionals have been growing strongly as well. At the other end of the spectrum, there's been enormous change in the other direction. Australia has lost nearly 400,000 labouring jobs. Nearly 500,000 clerical, administration and secretarial jobs have disappeared from the Australian economy over the last 25 years. This is enormous churn and change, and you can understand why it's generating anxiety right across the community. The outlook for young people is even more concerning. Remember that, of course, young people often take those jobs that are the first couple of rungs on the ladder of the career development progression. And those are precisely the jobs that are most quickly being lost to automation. The checkout job in a supermarket being replaced by a self-checkout machine. Even the job as a junior lawyer being replaced by artificial intelligence and software. At all ends of the spectrum, the jobs that our young people will be starting their careers with are disappearing from the economy at an increasing rate. 70% of young people enter jobs which are in the highest category of risk to automation. How are we preparing for this change? Well, if you just do a simple exercise, you look at every Australian student today. What course are they studying? What are the possible occupations that those courses are leading them towards? Simple exercise. And then you compare those occupations to the list of occupations that are at the highest risk of automation. And some of this data is contested and people have different views, but let's take this Oxford University Freyne Osborne study as a starting point. How many Australian students are currently, right now, studying in courses that are preparing them for jobs that are expected to disappear over the next 2 decades? 60%. 60% of all young Australians are studying for jobs that are likely to disappear. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all studying the wrong things. It doesn't necessarily mean that those courses are useless, but it does certainly underscore the change and dynamism in our labour market and the need for a radically different approach to the way that we educate our young people. The days of giving young people an intensive period of education up till they leave school, providing them with some post-school qualification, handing them a piece of paper, attaching a debt to that piece of paper, patting them on the back and saying, "Good luck out there, young man, young woman," must be over. Because that qualification that people get in their late teens, early 20s is no longer going to prepare them for the future world of work. And actually, that job change, the jobs growing and the jobs destroying, is only a small part of the total change. Yes, there will be jobs lost. Yes, there will be jobs gained. But the biggest impact of these technologies isn't actually in changing the jobs that we do. It's changing how we do the jobs that we already have. That's where most of the change is. To analyse this, we looked at every job in Australia. It's about 400 occupations across the workforce. And we divided those 400 occupations into 2,000 tasks within each of those jobs to look below the level of jobs at the tasks that Australian workers are actually doing as part of their jobs. And what this enables us to do is look not just at the impact of automation in terms of some jobs disappearing and some jobs being created, but look at the impact of automation on the way that we do our jobs. How are the tasks in our jobs changing? And we grouped those tasks into 6 categories. Interpersonal tasks, creative and decision-making tasks, information synthesis, making decisions off data, bringing data together, information analysis, sort of clerical administration type tasks, unpredictable physical tasks, you might think of that as peeling an avocado, something that's a bit hard for a robot to do, and predictable physical tasks, things that are very easy for robots to do. roles on production lines, for example. And at that level of tasks, below the level of jobs, we see extraordinary change in the labour market. Most of the change in tasks that Australians are undertaking isn't to do with them changing jobs, it's to do with them doing the jobs they already have differently. Australians are doing more and more interpersonal tasks as part of their jobs. Less and less physical tasks, particularly predictable physical tasks. They're doing more and more creative and decision-making tasks. Less and less administration and clerical tasks. So automation is taking the tasks out of our economy that are easier for machines to do and leaving tasks that are more suited to humans. And the interesting thing about this is it's not that the machines are taking away tasks and then humans are sitting idle. Humans are moving more into those tasks where we have what economists call comparative advantage. And that is a huge change. Our office in Sydney is right across, is on Martin Place, right across the street from the new flagship ANZ Bank branch. And they've just rebuilt it as the branch of the future. And I sort of look at it out the window as we work on these issues. And it's been a fascinating microcosm for what's really happening in the labour market. This is a 3-storey bank branch, and on the first storey and on the ground floor, the entire branch has changed. It's all technology. It's iPads, it's automatic teller machines, cheque deposit machines, a range of different ways to get information. There are almost no humans doing those administrative tasks. Gone are the days of people counting out wads of cash, doing simple transactions over the counter. This is a technology-filled space. There are 21 screens on that first floor of the ANZ Martin Place branch. But as I said, it's a 3-storey branch. So when you look up, the 2 floors above are filled with people. On the second floor is a floor devoted to providing advice. Little booths where customers can come in and get advice about wealth products, advice about insurance, a range of different sophisticated products. On the top floor is a seminar space where financial advisors, financial planners can provide courses, talks, information, lectures to people who come into the branch. So this is a story of change. The jobs have literally migrated up the floors of the bank branch. Fewer people doing back office administration, more people doing the interpersonal, creative, decision-making tasks. What are those skills of the future required for these tasks? How will our education system have to adapt to retrain the Australian workforce for this different world? We did a piece of work to try and get a handle on this question. And we decided that rather than make it up, rather than look into a crystal ball, we'd try and ask the authentic voice of the labour market. So as part of this work, we scraped every job ad in Australia. Over 18 months, that's 4.5 million job ads. And we went into all those job ads and we said, okay, what are all of the strings, all the words in those job ads? And we took 20,000 words, grouped them together to ask, what are the employers in these job ads asking for? What are the skills that they say are important? What are the skills that are worth them writing down in their job ads? And how are those changing over time? What are the words, what are the skills, what are the qualities that job ads today are asking more than they were 3 years ago? And the results are remarkable. Australian employers, yes, are asking for many more digital literacy skills. In all the job ads in Australia, every job ad in Australia combined, there's a 212% increase in the demand for a basket of skills that you might call digital literacy. But that's not the end of it. Australian employers are not just asking for digital skills, they're also asking for more human skills, the type of skills that support precisely the task changes that I described previously. Interpersonal tasks, creative tasks. Employers are asking for more critical thinking, they're asking for more creativity, they're asking for more problem solving, presentation skills, teamwork, building relationships. So this isn't a story of workers being replaced by machines. This is a story of employers asking for workers who can work with machines and who can do the human tasks that machines are less good at doing. Optimism. So we've talked a lot about fear. Lots of change in the labour market, lots of job change, lots of skill change, lots of need for retraining. And as I said, that anxiety is I believe, an impediment on policy, an impediment on business change, an impediment on the preparation of individuals for their own futures. There is an optimistic side to this story, and I think it's important to be optimistic and to recognise many of the positives. The first thing to say on the optimistic side of the ledger is that we have been here before. Despite all the heat and light about automation, about robots taking our jobs, the phenomenon of machines doing tasks that humans once did is far from new. This goes back to the Industrial Revolution. We didn't have data back to the Industrial Revolution, unfortunately, but we do have good data back to the 1950s. So we went with that data back to the 1950s and said, okay, is the rate of job loss to machines any faster today than it was for the last half century? Are machines taking the jobs of workers any faster today than they did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s? And the answer to that question is no. In the 1950s, as a proportion of the labour force, there were as many jobs, if not more jobs, being lost to machines than there are today. In the 1980s, there were as many jobs being lost to machines as there are today. The difference, though, is not in the number of jobs being lost to machines, but in the type of job. In the 50s, jobs were being lost by the tens of thousands from farms and agriculture, as mechanisation swept across agricultural production. In the 1980s and 90s, jobs were being lost from the factory floor in manufacturing. Today, the difference is that many jobs are now being lost from the services sector. So I think much of the heat and light about automation isn't actually about an acceleration in the change of job loss. It's about two things: an acceleration in the way that we all do our jobs, that task change that I mentioned before, and a shift into white-collar jobs. The second reason to be optimistic is that automation, the replacement of human tasks by machines, is, from an economist's perspective, first and foremost, a positive productivity shock. This is the essence of productivity growth, being able to do more with fewer workers, have the same or more output with fewer workers. That, at a micro level, is the essence of productivity growth. That is what automation is delivering. And if we care about our future living standards, we know that productivity is the primary driver of those future living standards. And so it's critical that we take advantage of this opportunity. If Australia embraces automation, then there is a $2 trillion dividend to our economy over the next 15 years. But here's the catch. You only get that dividend if two things are true. You only get that dividend if the workers and tasks that were done by humans that are displaced by machines are re-employed in new tasks. There's no point improving the productivity of two workers by firing one, replacing it with a machine, and that worker remaining idle. You get the huge productivity dividend, but only if the workers who are displaced are re-employed in those other tasks. Secondly, the second part of this dividend is that Australia needs to embrace automation. rather than fear it. Half of that gain will come from Australia accelerating the rate at which we are currently engaging in automation from our current level up to the level of some global peers. And as I'll show you in a moment, we currently lag behind in the rate at which Australian companies are embracing automation. But this is a huge economic dividend, by far the biggest policy opportunity that Australia has to improve productivity through business evolution and with automation and artificial intelligence as the driver of that. Not only is there an opportunity to create more wealth, there's an opportunity to create better jobs. This is data on workplace safety, on workplace injuries. And for many people, work is a dangerous task. When we look at the jobs in Australia which there are high injury rates, we take those jobs, break them down into tasks, and then attribute injuries not to jobs but to tasks, and then look at what I was showing you before, the rate at which machines are taking tasks out of the economy. It's not going to surprise you to find out that machines are taking away the most dangerous tasks that Australian workers do. The tasks that are coming out of the economy most quickly are the tasks that are associated with injuries. The lifting, the pulling, the dragging, the repetition. These are the tasks that are being automated. These are the tasks being done by machines, by robots. And so this is a trend which is massively improving workplace safety. And on its own, the continuation of this trend over the next 15 years will reduce workplace injuries in Australia by 11%, just by taking those dangerous tasks out of the economy, replacing them with machines. Identical data for satisfaction. Australia has fantastic workplace satisfaction data. You can attribute workplace satisfaction to every worker. You can then take that workplace satisfaction data and attribute it back to tasks. Once again, it's not going to surprise you to discover that the tasks in our jobs that are associated with higher satisfaction are the more human tasks. And the tasks, those interpersonal tasks, engaging with others, being creative, making decisions. And the tasks that are associated with less workplace satisfaction are the tasks that machines are increasingly taking on. The routine tasks, the administrative tasks, the physical tasks. You can do exactly the same thing with pay. You take the wage of every Australian, attribute it to their occupation, and then attribute it back to the tasks that they do. Those of you interested in the econometrics there's an explanation that I'll spare you in the back of our report. And when you look at the tasks that Australians get paid for, we predominantly aren't being paid by our employers for doing those administrative, clerical type tasks. It's the tasks within all of our jobs that are more interpersonal, more decision-making, more creative, that are the tasks that are associated with higher pay. So, the conclusion of this is that, yes, machines are taking humans' work, but there is another sense in which actually these are the types of tasks that are better suited to machines. For the last 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture, humans have been doing work that is really machine work. Work that is dirty, dangerous, and dull. And automation offers the opportunity to give some of that work back to machines, making the work that we do more human. More based on what we're good at as humans. Interpersonal skills, creative skills, decision-making skills. So we have an opportunity on the optimistic side of the ledger, not just to generate a productivity dividend, but to create more jobs and better jobs. I'm going to finish on fatalism. And the point I want to make here is that neither of these two scenarios are written in stone. The fear scenario of job loss, lower wages isn't inevitable. But neither is the optimism scenario of productivity growth, sharing the benefits of technology widely, increasing job numbers, better, more secure and more human employment. That's not inevitable either. And all the predictions about how automation and these technologies will either benefit or destroy our lives are examples of the fatalism that's creeping into this debate. And the problem with that fatalism is it takes away the agency of us. And the critical point here is that we as individuals, as businesses, our society, our government, have the power to determine which of these futures we're in. And rather than arguing about whether the technology is going to be a wonderful positive or a terrible negative, we need to get on and shape that to make sure that we do two things, that we harness the benefits of those technologies, but ensure that the downsides are managed and that those benefits are shared widely. The first example of fatalism I'm going to describe to you is about transitions. Every year in Australia, about 250,000 people go through a workplace transition. What is a workplace transition? Well, you can define it in many ways. We define it as involuntarily losing your job, being fired, your employer going out of business, being made redundant, a very significant cut to your hours. 250,000 Australians go through those transitions, and that number is increasing. And much of the political narrative is about, well, let's stop these transitions, let's stop the churn. The alternative narrative, which is less fatalistic, is to say, well, look, transitions are an inevitable part of the modern workplace. Rather than trying to argue against them or stop them, let's accept that they are an inevitability in the modern workplace and make sure those transitions are as positive as possible. And the point I want to make here on this chart is that nearly 20% of all these involuntary transitions are actually positive experiences for people. They come out of those transitions with higher pay, often retrained, better, more secure jobs. So the challenge for policymakers, for businesses who are going through business model evolutions isn't to hold back the tide of history and say we're never going to do any transitions. We're going to pretend that job loss isn't a part of this technological change. It's to recognise that it is, but to make those transitions a positive for the workers. To find mechanisms, pathways, tools to ensure that inevitable transitions are positive rather than negative. Let me finish on this slide. These technologies will affect different parts of the Australian workplace in different ways. There are future workers who have a lot to gain, who, if these technologies are embraced, will grow up in a workplace that is more competitive, has higher wages, stronger industries. There are workers on the top right-hand side of this chart, the sort of the mid-career people of higher skill who also have a lot to gain, for whom there'll be career opportunities, potential to do more. And then there are high-risk workers, those towards the end of their careers at lower skill, who are at the highest risk of these technologies. And we need to do two things. We need to recognise that there are different parts of the community with different approaches to these technologies, who have more and less to gain. And we need to have policies that are targeted at each of those different segments, recognising the value in all of them. Not just focusing on the people at the highest risk and using that as a reason to hold back the tide of technology, but also not blindly focusing on the positives for future generations and high-skilled workers. And that, I think, is part of the challenge here. To reject the blind optimism, to reject the negativity and say, how do we make this work for the Australian people to ensure that we harness the benefits of technology, but make everyone included in those benefits. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we have time for questions now for Andrew. So I believe we have a couple of roving mics and we have a hand up already. So, mic number 1, if we can get that over to the hand. I love the enthusiasm, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is it on? Thank you very much for that information and that optimism. I'm Darren Harvey from CTO Group. I was watching a talk by Jeremy Rifkin called The Third Industrial Revolution. He talked about the decreasing state of productivity overall. Do you see that? He also talked about the optimism of the sharing generation or Gen Y being a key enabler out of that lowering productivity. Do you see that, and do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think that the worst thing we could do to young people, to future generations, would be to hold back the tide of these technologies. This is the productivity growth dividend that we can leave them. If we embrace these technologies, harvest the productivity dividend, then young people grow up with higher incomes, more secure jobs, a stronger economy, stronger Australian industries. I think that is, the critical intergenerational question here is about, on that previous slide, how much do we weight the interests of people in their late career who are at risk of these technologies versus the students, the Australians yet unborn, who will be the primary beneficiary of these technologies. And that's fundamentally the political balance, to get that balance right. And as I say, I think part of the challenge in managing that balance is to think about those groups differently and address their legitimate concerns as being legitimate, as being both real concerns and things that both need to be addressed.
We have another question over here. If I could just ask, when asking a question, if you could please tell us who you are and where you're from in your opening moment. So please go ahead, sir.
Greg Borer from CDC. I'm not sure of your family situation, but if you do, or if you are going to have children, what would you encourage them to, based on all of what you know today and your research and personal experience, what area would you encourage them to study?
I love this question. Thank you. It's amazing when we do this research. We've presented it in lots of different forums. We've presented it at schools. We've presented it at conferences. We've presented it in lots of boardrooms. And no matter where you are, you could be sitting in the biggest, fanciest boardroom in Australia talking about technology, and you just see very quickly people's minds go from the macro issues of productivity growth and efficiency, and then just through the presentation they suddenly go, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my kids? And I think that's the beauty of this issue. It's incredibly important as a national issue, but incredibly personal to all of us in our own careers and in the careers of our kids. I do have 2 kids. One is 2, one is 4. Their approach to education at the moment is emerging. I would encourage them to be adaptable in their skill acquisition. They will go through a period of enormous change. They might live to be 100. Their working life could be 70 years long. Most of, my 4-year-old son will spend most of his working life in the second half of the 21st century. So my response to that is to take a fair bit of humility to the prediction about what skills and tasks he will be doing in the second half of the 21st century, because it's a long way away and there's lots of uncertainty. And therefore, to encourage him to pick up skills that are adaptable skills. And that's why I was really heartened by the research that looked at what employers are asking for. They were really adaptable skills. What I didn't show you was it was a huge premium not on qualifications. Hasn't been a huge increase in employers asking for a Cert 3, a Cert 4, a diploma or a bachelor. There's been a huge increase in employers asking for adaptable skills and capabilities. The ability to think creatively, the ability to problem solve, the ability to work in teams, the ability to do a presentation, communicate with people. Those adaptable skills that young people can take through various incarnations of their profession, of their professional lives, I think are the best skills to equip young people. My personal view is that will require a revolution in the way that education is delivered in Australia. As I said, if you take everyone in this room, everyone in Australia, and you add up how many hours of education everyone in Australia has had up to this point today, that number is 190 billion hours. Every Australian has had 190 billion hours of education in our lives up to this point, up to 2018. Now, 87% of those hours were accumulated before we were 21. If I think about the optimal profile of human capital investment, what economists call human capital investment, but you can just call where should you get education through the course of your life, you would expect it to be front-loaded to the period of youth. But I don't think in the future it's going to be that front-loaded. I think that 87% of our education before the age of 21, 13% after, is going to change. I think it's going to be, I shudder to predict, but I think it's going to be very different to that in the future, as young people need to retrain, pick up new skills through an evolving and dynamic economy.
So we've got a few questions banking up. We've got one from the CEO. He gets prerogative, so I'll let him go first. We have another one towards the back and then one at the front. So if we can go through any other hands up, just so we know how to get to you. One over in the far side as well, and if we have time, we'll come back to the gentleman here. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Brad. Is this on?
Yep.
Rob Fitzpatrick, CEO of AIIA. Andrew, thanks for that presentation. Sorry, Greg, I'm going to drag us back up to the macro for a minute, if I can. The 2.2 trillion size of the prize, that to me sounds like it is an extraordinary number that any politician, senior bureaucrat, senior business person would be racing to go after. Of the 2.2 trillion that you talked about, I'd like to unpack that a little and understand how much of that is uniquely Australian and how much of that is a global comparative advantage. How much should we be trying to race to achieve in Australia now? And I guess the subtext to that, what would you advise us to do to be able to work together to capitalise on that?
Thanks. So in terms of the breakdown of the 2 trillion, the components of that are increasing productivity in each part of the labour market, combined with making sure that any tasks displaced are, any humans displaced are re-employed, plus going forward and embracing technology more than we are today. I'll go back to the chart that I missed to answer this question. This is a list of Australia's, of peer countries and the rate at which companies are embracing automation. The way that we've calculated this, there's no globally recognised measure of automation. So we created this, but I'm happy to say it's subsequently been adopted by the Department of Industry. We said we're going to look at every firm level data, and say if we observe a firm which has a significant increase in labour productivity, then we're going to give it a tick as a sign of potentially being a firm engaging in automation. However, there are lots of reasons why productivity can increase that aren't related to automation, so we're going to do a second step. We also need to see a significant investment in CapEx or software. If we see those two things at the same time, then we're going to say, okay, that's a pretty good proxy that this is a firm that's made a big investment and improving their labour productivity. That's automation. It's not perfect, but it's our proxy for the number of firms that are engaging in automation. We took that definition, applied it to Australia, and then all these other countries. And Australia is towards the bottom of the pack. So to your question about where we sit in terms of the international, how much of this will flow from global trends and how much will flow from Australia's particular efforts, Australia's got catching up to do. And it's fascinating when you show people this chart, it makes them think, particularly when you show politicians. Politicians are very worried about job loss, very worried about the impact of automation on vulnerable communities. You say to them, well, where would you like to be? Would you like to be at the top of this list with the most automation, or would you like to be at the bottom? And it's a difficult question because it goes to that trade-off. Should Australia be embracing automation in a way that creates risks for some workers but huge benefits to future generations? Or should we be slowing down automation? I'll tell you what I'd like to be, ramping up automation for Australia to be one of the leaders and having policies in place to make sure the benefits are widely shared.
Great. So we had a question, I think, at the back.
Hi, Jared from Outcome.life. I started my career as an accountant, spent 10 years in the profession and started seeing some of the writing on the wall and got out and now run my own IT companies. One of our businesses focuses on employability for students. And it does worry me, and your stats have supported this, how we're still training students for traditional degrees in education where jobs may not exist or probably won't exist in the future. And I think there's two issues that are raised there. One is the revolution of education, which you probably need a full week-long conference just on that topic alone. Yeah. But the other one is it's almost like we need young people to now walk without the crawling part. I know when I started my career, I was trained by doing the administrative and the secretarial, photocopying and sending faxes, but it's all part of the process. It's how you learn, because you can't give advisory type work and the more high-level skills until you've learned how to do it in the real world. So do you have any thoughts on how we're going to deal with the next generation coming through? And I feel sorry for them in that the expectations of sort of walking before crawling is now upon them.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, walking before crawling. As you say, it's those bottom rungs of the employment ladder that are being taken out faster than others. We're doing some research right now, which we haven't released, and it asks the question, it responds to this key fact, which I think everyone's aware of, that the average time for a young Australian between leaving education and getting a full-time job, a first career job, if you like, is 2.7 years. So young people are spending 2.7 years in this twilight zone between finishing their education and starting their careers proper, if you like. Obviously, some are faster than that and some are slower, but that's the average, 2.7 years. And then we use this fantastic source of data called the LSAT, Longitudinal Study of Australian Youth, which tracks 15,000 Australian young people over time. And we said, okay, what are the characteristics of the young people that are getting into work faster? What are the characteristics of the young people who are going quickly from education into employment? And what are the characteristics of the young people who are right at the other end of the spectrum, that are taking 3, 4, 5 years to find their feet? And the results are fascinating. There are many factors that matter. The young people's state of mind, their happiness, their optimism matters. More optimistic young people get jobs faster. It's probably not a surprise. What's the biggest factor? The thing that drives the biggest difference, the characteristics of the young people who we track in that LSAT survey, who were fastest between finishing their education and getting their first professional job. The biggest by a factor of 2, twice as big as any other factor, was if that young person had done related part-time work / internships in that field. So if young people are doing that crawling, if you like, to use your analogy, during their education, they shave an average, in our modelling, they shave an average of 1.4 years off that 2.7 average. So they're halving the time if those young people have spent time in a related field. That doesn't mean flipping burgers at McDonald's, that's not a related field. If they're doing some kind of work experience. The second one, by the way, the second strongest factor to get young people quickly from education into work was their exhibiting of these soft skills, these enterprise skills, presentation skills, teamwork skills, communication skills. So I think that's part of the new way that young people will have to learn to crawl.
Good. So we've got a couple more questions. We'll take the one on the far side, and there was one back here. All right, so we'll take that one first and then back to this side of the room, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Carolina from the Minerals Council. Sort of following on from what you've just said and from the first question, access to technology has already transformed the way that we communicate, the way that we learn, the way that we engage with one another, the way that we live. And I'm curious just to hear a bit from your perspective, given that you're now looking at automation changing the way that the skills that people need back into communication, interpersonal skills that have already so significantly been transformed and in some ways have been hindered and in other ways enhanced. How do you see that interplay given that technology is now requiring young people in particular to be reverting back to interpersonal skills and things that make or seem to be making them uncomfortable these days?
Yeah, look, great question. I think it is a change in mindset. For young people, it's less about picking up that, set of vocational skills and more about picking up a set of adaptable human skills that they can apply in a range of different contexts and will apply in a range of different contexts through a changing career. And I think that is a big change. But remember, people are very adaptable. I think if you went back 60 years when most people had pretty linear careers involving one, maybe two jobs during the course of their career, and you said to people back then, guess what? In 50 years' time, the average number of jobs that a person will have will be 11. People would have been pretty shocked. But one of the most remarkable things, in my view, over the last 50 years is the way that we've adapted to that as individuals and as a society. I think young people would be horrified now at the thought of having one job their whole life. So people are pretty adaptable. It's not easy, but I think over time it occurs. I mean, you mentioned you're from the Minerals Council. I think these issues are. The mining industry is a great example of these issues. The mining industry is on the forefront of a technology revolution. That revolution will ensure that Australia's mining industry remains the most competitive in the world, but it has implications for the labour market. Those implications are not all positive, but they are positive in aggregate, because having a strong competitive mining industry will create more jobs across the economy. And facing into that issue, I think I think the mining industry is a really good example of all these issues.
All right, we'll take the question here, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Cecilia Ridgely from ACT Government, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the opportunities for social inclusion that some of these technologies are going to be providing for the workforce going forward. We've talked a lot about transitioning people from the jobs they're in to the jobs that they will have. The people who aren't in jobs, people who are disabled or people who are limited in their ability to engage with the workforce, are there opportunities that are being provided that are new?
Yeah, great question. I think there are. I don't think it's automatic. Again, I don't want to be blindly optimistic or blindly negative about this, but I think that technology affords the opportunity for us to take agency and create those opportunities. I think for marginalised workers, the opportunity to work in different ways, in more flexible ways, to do different types of work, to be assisted by machines in their work, is a significant opportunity. Obviously, one of the major reforms that Australia is undertaking at the moment through the NDIS is a huge investment, and one of the priorities of that investment is to support people with disability into employment to the greatest extent possible. And I think there've been some good early but good strides in that direction, and much of that comes from technology opportunities. For me, this is where the focus should be. Not in holding back the benefits of technology, but taking those benefits and ensuring they are distributed well, ensuring that we use these technologies to build an inclusive economy. And I think that's the real opportunity.
We've got one hand up. If we can keep it quick, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Andrew. Absolutely brilliant presentation and research, and some great messages there. But the key question going through my mind is, how do we change the political narrative? We've had even this week, calls for changing the workplace arrangements to protect and to sort of reinstate what we had decades ago. The sentiment behind that is very genuine. But I think the data that you've got and other research shows we actually need to change the whole way in which we approach the work of the future. So how do we get government or convince government to think of it in a wholly new way? What's our role and what's the role of other stakeholders?
Yeah, great question. This is the big issue. How do we, and let's be honest, politicians are fearful of this trend. And, if I was a politician, I probably would be as well. This is a trend that creates a lot of anxiety in the community. People are worried about their jobs, they're worried about their livelihoods, and that creates a lot of fear amongst the political class. How do we unpack that? Well, I think it's by, as businesses and individuals, by working to redress that fear. What does that mean? I think it means being much more honest as businesses about the change that is coming, facing into that change, recognising that those transitions are going to happen, they are going to accelerate, more people are going to be part of it, and proactively managing those transitions to make them positive experiences. And as we've seen, there are already lots of those transitions which are positive experiences, and we need to turn the vast majority of them into positive experiences. And I think if we can flip the mindset from job transitions are a disaster, they're the worst year of your life, you've lost your job, you're unemployed, you've been rejected, flip that to another narrative. And that other narrative is something like, look, everyone goes through job transitions, it's a dynamic labour market, you need to prepare for them before they occur, see them as an opportunity. All of us are going to have experiences in our lives where we lose a job, the employer that employs us goes out of business, our role changes. So how do we prepare right through the course of our career so that we're ready in advance when those changes occur? We already have we've been training on the side, we have great ideas about where our skills can go next. We have great job matching technology that help us connect to new opportunities. So these transitions become not an unambiguous negative, but they become a fact of life that we all manage, and we all manage in a proactive way, and many of us come out the better for it. If we can flip to something like that narrative about proactively embracing change, then I think we have the beginnings of a new narrative, but I don't want to underestimate the challenge. This is a very, very hard sell for politicians, and you can see them struggling with it right now.
So I know there are more questions out there, but unfortunately we are at time. So please join me in thanking Andrew for that presentation and for his great...
Thank you.